In this presentation, I'm going to discuss Mexican foodways in the upper Midwestern United States. For the past 6 years or so, I've been conducting both archival research and community-based research using oral history methods to investigate the experiences of Mexican migrant communities in the state of Michigan. I'll share a bit of that research with you here, while also discussing the overarching political and ideological systems impacting Mexican and Mexican-American communities, and those systems that have shaped the relationship between food systems in the United States and Mexico. I wanted to take a moment to give you a snapshot of some key information. Michigan, where much of my community-based research takes place, is about 1,500 miles from Mexico, depending on which part of the border you're going to. One of the things we are known for in Michigan is the Great Lakes, of which there are 5, and these constitute roughly 25% of the fresh water in the entire world. There's also a great deal of agriculture across Michigan, and this is one of the reasons why there are significant Mexican communities here. Many agricultural companies have historically and today sought after undocumented Latino people in particular to work in their fields, harvesting crops, for example. Being undocumented or not having the official paperwork making it legal for them to be working in the US, these workers have virtually no rights. They're underpaid, often well below minimum wage. They're also often seasonal workers, meaning that they travel to Michigan from their homes in places such as Mexico and Central America, being separated from their families for months at a time, and are often provided with minimal or even awful living conditions, being lodged with a great number of other workers in small spaces. This is actually how my family also wound up in Michigan, which is really what ignited my interest in this research topic initially. The most recent 2020 US Census data estimates that those of Latin American descent make up 18.7% of the US population, with Mexicans as the largest nationality among that group. These numbers do not perhaps account for the thousands of undocumented Latino farm workers in the region. So already we see that the food, economic, and political systems in the US and Mexico are deeply intertwined, with some clear power dynamics at play. I'll point to historical examples, some dating back decades or centuries, and others much more recent, to help illustrate the exploitation of Mexican and indigenous communities by US companies and government entities. For example, the entirety of what today is known as the Southwestern United States used to be Mexican territory. Through military invasion resulting in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, this land was essentially seized by the United States. And so there is a great hypocrisy here, given the colonization of the Americas by European settlers and their descendants, the theft of Mexican and indigenous lands by the United States, that today there is so much hostility against Latinos and Mexicans in the United States. On August 3rd, 2019, a man walked into a busy grocery store in El Paso, Texas, and used a gun to kill 23 people and injure 23 more. The shooter later told authorities he was targeting Mexican people in order to fight the invasion of Mexicans into the United States. And so these are just some of the representative examples of the climate in which Mexican people are living in the US. This is why so many Mexican people today are familiar with the following quote by Porfirio Díaz, who was a 31-year president of Mexico in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He's often quoted as having said, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States." But what do we mean when we say Mexican food? Many Mexican foods have become popular in the US. Tacos, burritos, quesadillas, and guacamole are commonplace in most regions of the US, though these items constitute only a fragment of Mexican cuisine, which is also lush with soups, desserts, an infinite number of salsas, really, many or most of which are often too spicy for the typical American palate. Mexican cuisine is many thousands of years old. Mexican, as a term, is in one sense a nationality, but Mexican culture itself and most Mexican people are indigenous to North America. Recipes for tamales, for example, which are a corn-based dough that hold a variety of fillings and are steamed in corn husks or banana leaves, have been passed down for millennia. We know this through oral histories that have been passed down, and we know this also because of ancient depictions of tamales in cultural ceremonies. Here in the bottom right-hand corner, we see a depiction of tamales being a central part of a ceremony in this classic Mayan iconography. Of course, Mexican cuisine has changed greatly over the centuries, and especially over the most previous decades. From an overarching perspective, colonialism is the system that has forced the most change. And colonial tactics have been used by European powers for a long time to subjugate indigenous populations across the Americas, often centering around food systems. For example, settlers specifically targeted buffalo because they knew how central buffalo were to the survival and cultural identities of particular tribes. And this was done to the point that buffalo were very nearly went extinct. Indigenous crops were burned. European crops were imposed upon indigenous communities and given an air of prestige, while indigenous foods were often seen as dirty, unholy, or savage. This is where there's a debate, a tension between corn and flour tortillas, because corn is indigenous and very central to Mexican identity, whereas flour really came from Europe, so flour tortillas weren't invented until much later. More recently, neoliberalism, which I would characterize as a particular form of colonialism, has been the overarching system that has been changing Mexican foodways and Mexican relationships with land. Neoliberalism is relatively young, dating back only to the 1930s, and did not become the dominant political ideology in the United States until several decades later. In a theoretical sense, neoliberalism is an ideology that places its trust in the free market. The idea that all issues, including environmental and social issues, are best left to be worked out with little to no intervention from the government. In turn, neoliberalism is a system that relies on the exploitation of food workers, of natural resources, of animals, and even of consumers themselves. Philip Murawski argues that leftist thinkers often mischaracterize neoliberalism by overlooking a key point. Where neoliberalism actually differs from other forms of right-wing thinking is that neoliberalism argues for state intervention in order to create a specific kind of free market. Therefore, neoliberalism is not actually opposed to big government. Rather, it relies heavily on big government in order to impose its vision upon the world. Especially in relation to food, a well-known neoliberal policy illustrating this point is the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. While this trade policy was debated in the United States, Mexico went to civil war over it. Indigenous communities who were going to suffer the most as a result of NAFTA staged an armed rebellion on January 1st, 1994, the day NAFTA was set to go into effect. While this rebellion did create lasting movements for indigenous sovereignty in the country, the overarching devastating impact of NAFTA took course anyhow. More than 2.5 million Mexicans lost their livelihoods because of NAFTA. Crops such as corn that small-scale Mexican farmers depended on selling began flooding into Mexico from US corporations who were able to produce and sell the corn at a cheaper rate, using very unsustainable and environmentally harmful agricultural practices a lot of the time. It is estimated that NAFTA caused roughly 1 million people to migrate every year from Mexico to the United States for a decade after it was passed. So here again, we see the hypocrisy of the United States, how it simultaneously works to destabilize Mexico while also projecting hostility and violence towards Mexican immigrants in the US. We also see the disconnect between powerful Mexican elites who make deals with the US government at the expense of its own people, especially at the expense of its own indigenous people. In this way, neoliberalism functions as a colonial system of exploitation that draws power from its ability to destroy indigenous relationships with the land through physical displacement, economic manipulation, and cultural racism. I want to step back for a moment and think about different worldviews that are being enacted here. through the food-related practices of both colonial powers and indigenous communities. Different worldviews end up shaping different food systems and practices. Think of the mantra that says humans are at the top of the food chain. This reflects a hierarchical worldview in which humans separate ourselves from nature by exerting our dominance over it. We are supposedly at the top with no natural predators, and therefore have little incentive to think about the ways in which our actions may actually come back to hurt us in the long run. By separating humans from nature in a cosmological sense, the groundwork was laid for the emergence of a predatory food system that has been shaped drastically by the rise of neoliberalism over the past 75 years. So classic kinds of capitalist values that prioritize profits over labor rights, environmental concerns, and public health, while also creating a quote unquote free market legislation that imposes global capitalism upon more localized food industries. So NAFTA, perhaps being the most well-known example, which destroyed the livelihood of many smaller scale Mexican farm workers. To give another example, Carol Adams in her iconic book, The Sexual Politics of Meat, shows how hierarchical food systems also intersect with racism and white supremacy. Adams describes the work of George Beard, a 19th century medical doctor who specialized in the diseases of middle-class people and who recommended that when white civilized middle-class men became susceptible to nervous exhaustion, they should eat more meat. To him, and for many others, Adams argues, cereals and fruits were lower than meat on the scale of evolution and thus appropriate foods for other races and white women, who appeared to be lower on the scale of evolution as well. Racism and sexism together upheld meat as white man's food, end quote. Influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution, Beard asks how it is that savages and semi-savages, by which he means indigenous and mixed indigenous people, are able to survive very well without a great deal of animal protein. He answers by writing that they are, quote, little removed from the common animal stock from which they are derived. They are much nearer to the forms of life from which they feed than are the highly civilized brain workers, and can therefore subsist on forms of life which would be most poisonous to us. Secondly, savages who feed on poor food are poor savages and intellectually far inferior to the beef eaters of any race, end quote. That's George Beard. For thousands of years, indigenous people across North America have participated in what many scientists and farmers know today as intercropping, growing two or more crops together within the same space in a beneficial manner. In original local indigenous foods, stories, and recipes from the upper Midwest, Lisa Erdrich tells a version of the story of the three sisters, perhaps the most widely known example of intercropping. The story explains how the plants of corn, beans, and squash are grown together in a symbiotic fashion. Beyond simply showing how these plants can be grown for consumption, the story highlights the important lessons of interdependence and reciprocity. Each plant's well-being is dependent on the other plants, and each plant has its role to play in order to make the system both efficient and beneficial for all of the plants. Comrade plant. Further south, the three sisters are called Las Tres Hermanas, and by others, Los Tres Amigos del Pobre, the three friends of the poor. Another common difference is that chiles are sometimes replacing the squash, or chili peppers are considered the fourth sister, and makes it easier to digest the proteins in beans and corn. Mexican anthropologist Guillermo Bonfil Batalla identifies the growing of corn, beans, squash, and chile together as the classic milpa of Indian agriculture. Together, these plants work not only to produce crops, but to regenerate the soil so that the process can be replicated. Even in terms of nutrition, the plants together comprise the foundation of a diet that has sustained indigenous people for thousands of years. Indigenous communities have long understood the benefits of the regenerating Three Sisters approach, but recent scientific studies have also shown it to yield more energy and more protein than when the individual crops of corn, beans, and squash are grown separately, among other nutritional benefits. Still today, the milpa stands as a model of self-sustainable agriculture both a symbol and a practice of cultural sustainability. Like the agricultural practice of the milpa, traditional diets such as this are complete, self-sustaining, and regenerative. Furthermore, the Three Sisters are resistant to capitalist forms of land management, diet, and economy. Intercropping stands in contrast to the proliferation of monocropping and the broader industrialization of agricultural practices that are also associated with capitalism. I think that the patterns here are clear between the constant growth and the exploitation enacted by capitalist thinking and the approaches taken by indigenous communities that view themselves as part of the ecosystems in which they farm, sell, and consume food items. So all of this has been necessary context in which to understand the ideological, economic, and cultural context in which Mexican communities in Michigan are living. Their migration to this region has been shaped by the projects of colonialism and neoliberalism. By focusing on the small city of Battle Creek, I think the nuanced stories of these communities will show how immigrant peoples are surviving despite the challenges and violences resulting from displacement, racism, and pressures of assimilation. In addition to highlighting these histories, food also tells a lot about the ongoing continuance of Mexican traditions in Michigan, because so much of the communities we create here are made with and through food. Southwest Detroit is one of the more widely recognized examples with its many Mexican restaurants and mercados, as well as its strong contingent of Chicano artists and activists. But there are also many keepers of Mexican culture in rural areas of Michigan as well. Towns like Saginaw, Benton Harbor, and Battle Creek may not maintain the sheer numbers of Mexican people than larger cities like Detroit and Grand Rapids in Michigan, but community is maintained in these areas through cooking, farming, and of course, feasting.